that you point out tonight that we need to repent of. I pray that we'd be willing to do that, change our course, so that we can walk more closely with you. I pray that you'll do that in our hearts. Bless our time now as we look into the Word. Thank you for the sweet, as you turn there, we, of course, when we were looking, last week, we looked at, of course, the family of Israel. Joseph passed away, and the whole family was forgotten, new pharaohs, and so now what? Now they're at a place for the family that's still residing there after 400 years. It's grown leaps and bounds, and now we come to a place where we have we transition. Chapter 2 is a transition. Interesting though, as we were going through it, I kind of didn't feel like we really finished real well. In verse 18, and the king of Egypt called for the midwives, chapter 1, and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives. I think what we almost concluded, or we didn't really come to I would say a good conclusion. I don't feel like, at least. I feel like we kind of touched on, I was talking the morality side of things, like the lying. I think we make an assumption there that they were lying. Now, the one thing that they did not do, that they weren't willing to do, was to end life, right? So the question was, so in verse 18, why have you done this thing and have saved the men children alive? In other words, why haven't you killed the men children? Their answer was, what was their answer? Okay, well, the wives have had the babies so fast. Well, that didn't really answer the question, did it? The question was, why haven't you killed them? Now, I would say that he must have had respect for these midwives. And he didn't hold them accountable to the point where he could have easily, said, that's it. You midwives are done. I'm going to end your lives, and we're going to go out like, the Gestapo, and we're going to find all these babies and kill them. So I find that interesting. I do believe it was the Lord's protection. And I think sometimes what we do is we remove the Lord so much from it, and we try to deal with things in such a human way that we kind of miss something. I read this, and I thought this was helpful. He states, the author said, rather than trying to argue for a justifiable lie on the part of the midwives seeking to protect God's people, take it as a statement of what was true. God was directly involved in this affair of birth and national growth. That's the key to understanding why no decree of Pharaoh would work out as he intended it, and why Hebrew women were so healthy and gave birth with ease. And I thought he put that so well. Sometimes we're just trying to find an excuse, and I think we've removed God from it almost, and we have to put God in there and say, God did all this. He protected the ladies from being killed, for not killing the babies. He is the one that I think they were actually telling the truth. I don't think they were lying. I think it was true that these women were having their children quickly. I think I've shared with you before, but when Casey had Brooke, she was at church that Sunday night, 7 o'clock at night. She was apparently having contractions. We got home. Right after the service, she said, I was having contractions during the service. It might be tonight, that we have to go in. I said, oh, okay. We got home. She sat on the couch. Everything was fine. She had told her mom, now it's about 10 o'clock at night. And her mom gave us a phone call and said, it was probably more like 10:30 or 11. She said, have you counted the time between contractions? Because if I'm coming over now. I don't want to call later on, So in other words, if you're going to go to the hospital, tell me now. So Casey then, over the next 15 minutes or so, began to realize, oh, the contractions are like 2 minutes apart. So she said, yeah, we probably should go. Now it's 11 o'clock. So we finally get out of the house. We get to the hospital. It was a traumatic experience for sure. So any of you ladies, you know what she's talking about. So can that kind of a thing happen? Absolutely. I've been there when it did. The baby came before the doctor got there. And so it was a fast thing. So when I read that, I can definitely see the Lord and his hand in it. So let's not remove God's involvement, because God was involved through this whole thing. Yes. Sure, that's a very good point. I don't know if you could hear that, but Terry brought out that we see in the text more than once the rigor that these people had to go through in their service, which would make you more fit. And the Egyptian ladies may have been couch potatoes a little bit more, and less fit and able, and so that would have helped for sure, which was actually the Egyptians' fault, right? Yes. I was born in South Miami Hospital Elevator. My mom couldn't make it into the room. Wow. So yeah, right. It can happen. Yeah, we just. It's just a God thing. Yes, it is. Yeah, and here you are. Yes. All right, we're in chapter 2 now. I just wanted to touch on that. I've been carrying that all week, and I even thought, how do I bring this in on Sunday? And the Lord didn't make that available, so tonight I wanted to do that. Verse number 1 of chapter 2, and there went a man of the house of Levi and took to a wife a daughter of Levi. So let me just pause here. We are clearly transitioning away from the family, this family of Israel. When I say Israel, I mean Jacob. Now we are transitioning more to a nation. So now we're looking, and that's where Exodus takes us. It takes us to a family that has grown exponentially. And so no longer do we see them as an individual family unit. Now we're looking at them as a nation. And they're dwelling in another country. And that country has become, overwhelmed with their presence, I think is maybe a way we could put that. Now we're going to an individual family of one of the tribes, Levi, and a man and his wife. And the woman conceived, verse 2, and bare a son, and when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, healthy, an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's edge. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it, and the child grew. And she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water. In other words, his name is Moses because he was drawn out of the water. The same meaning. The name means that. So tonight I want to talk about God's deliverer. God's deliverer in chapter 2. We see this. We see God's plan really unfolding. In Genesis, we saw these covenants that God had made with a family, beginning with Abraham. And he continued those covenants through Isaac and into Jacob. And so we're hearing about these covenants that are made and the promises, in other words, that God makes with this family. Now we get to 400 years down the road. We see God's blessing upon this family at chapter 1 in Exodus. And now we come to a point where we realize there's pressure on these people. And what's going to happen to these people? Well, Egypt is getting more and more frustrated with them, so they're considering what to do with them. Well, let's make them work really hard. And so that's what they've done. So we get to chapter 2, and now there's a focus. The focus is on a family within that family, okay, that original family that we were talking about. But we're talking about 400 years later. And now you have this couple who we know from the text later on had 2 children already, and so now it's the 3rd child. Well, before we go any further, how does this follow God's pattern? I mean, we've seen this kind of a thing before, right? Who were the others that we saw something similar with? Was Isaac the first child of Abraham? No. Okay, what about Jacob? Was he the first child of Isaac? Well, technically, no. He was the second, barely, but he was. I mean, he was even clinging to his brother. So here you have it again. And really, you follow this through Scripture, and you see that it's not always the firstborn, the assumed one, because God is in control. He's the one that takes matters into the deliverer, God's deliverer here. And I love it. As I was studying through this and reading through this, I couldn't help but really see a lot of types from here, where you see Moses, and then you'll see Jesus later on. And I'm not a crazy type guy, but there were a lot of things, similarities, that I thought, wow, you can see God working to deliver his people from Egypt, and then you can see how God delivers his people from sin. And he provides a deliverer for that. Deliverer from Egypt, deliverer from our sin. And so there are all these different types that you'll see even throughout. But as we look at, we first of all see the birth of the deliverer. Wow. You're going to have all the questions tonight because I apparently didn't go. I knew I didn't do something. So I'm gonna hold all the questions back from you so you can't see them until we get to the final one. Terrible. All right, what do you learn about the parents of Moses in verses 1 and 2? Just real quick, just look at them. What do you learn about them? Okay, they're from the priestly line. We know about the priestly line later on, right? It hadn't been officially formulated at this point, but yeah, that would be the priestly line. So Moses would be from the tribe of Levi. What else do you learn about them? Yes. Yes, indeed it was. Yes, yeah. Were you going to say something, brother?
I can't remember. I think with the... let's just let it go. I think he was close.
Looking at 1 and 2, what do you learn about the parents of Moses? Okay, we know they're of the tribe of Levi. What else do you learn? Not just verse 1, but also verse 2. Yes. All right, good. She was courageous. She hid the child for 3 months. Was she disobedient? Okay, she feared God. Good. Technically the answer would be yes, she was disobedient, but to man, but she was obedient to God. She feared God. And so ultimately she wasn't disobedient. She was obedient because to save life is God's plan. Yes. Right. Yep, right. We don't have that indication here yet, but we know that based upon what we've read before. So, yeah, it says, and the woman conceived. What's interesting about that? She conceived. When did she conceive? We don't exactly know when it was communicated by Pharaoh to kill the boys. I'm guessing it was already communicated. Not sure. But there's courage here, courageous. That she conceived and then she hid the child. She was willing to obey God rather than man. And I think that's an important aspect of what we see here from her. There's not much said about his dad, but about his mom, you learn a great deal in this. What does it mean she could no longer hide him? Verse 3. Okay, he was getting bigger. Yes. Getting louder. Babies get louder? Sure they do. Yeah. There might be different needs that were taking place. But yeah, it was impossible to hide him. And so she makes an ark, a basket we think of as reading. And somebody said, the same kind of terminology from Noah's ark to this are used. And it's kind of fascinating when you consider that. Here's another vessel that's used to save life. Kind of cool when you think of it that way. Yeah. Yes, right. What do you think Moses' mother's plan was after she put him in the river? Pray. Okay, good. Yep. What else? Do you think there was any other plan? Do you think she just kind of winged it? I'm just going to put him in the river and hope for the best. Okay, quite possibly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. She said, I think God led her to put him in the river. Yeah. Yeah, there's not much here that communicates exactly, did they plan this? Did they say, well, let's put him in the river close to where the princess will come? Did they do that? I don't know. We don't know because the text doesn't tell us that, but I do think her plan after that was exactly that. Pray. God, I don't know what's going to happen, but I can't keep him in the house because they're going to come and they're going to kill him, and they might do something to us too for disobeying the laws. So verse 4, and his sister stood afar off to wit, or to see what would be done to him. I think a lot of people might just say, well, mom probably put the sister out there. I'm not so sure about that. When you read this, his sister stood afar off. It's almost like she was curious. I mean, here's her little brother that she loves. She probably got to hold him while she sat on the floor. Maybe when mom was making dinner, mom said to Miriam, I want you to hold the baby, take care of the baby. And so she had grown very fond of the baby, and now mom is weeping, and she's putting together this little ark, putting him into the water, and Miriam's probably doing the same, and now mom takes him out to the river. And so what does she do? She goes out there, she stands a good distance off to watch what happens. Now, what's in that river? Yeah. You ever been to Mayaca River State Park? Yeah. No fun. Snakes? Yeah, probably. We got home tonight, or in between getting home from the office, and opened the garage door. We're driving up and we see a black racer. And he's on our driveway, and he's chasing a big lizard. And we spoiled his dinner. Not only that, but he turned around, he went in the garage. And I couldn't really scare him out. So we went into the house. We're not too afraid of a black racer. They don't want us. If there's anything in there, he'll eat it anyway. So 15 minutes later, I went out to the garage to get something, and man, he was 2 steps away from me. I was in my socks and everything, but I don't want to step on him. So anyway, you brought up a snake, so could have been snakes or whatever in the water. So here we have the birth of the deliverer. You want to talk about a traumatic experience and a very dramatic story? Here you have. Okay, so then you have the protection of the deliverer. I'll show you that much. What is significant about the princess's reaction to the Hebrew baby being in the little basket, or the ark, in verse 6? And when she had opened it, she saw the child, beheld the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Okay, so what is significant about the princess's reaction to the Hebrew baby being in this basket? Yes.
Men maybe not have this idea, well, big deal. But what woman can not look at a child with care and concern when a child starts crying?
Exactly.
And maybe God just pinched his heel when she
Yep.
the lid off and made Moses start crying.
Yeah. Or maybe when she opened up the basket, the Lord had the sun right in his eyes. Boom. It hit him, woke him up, and he started crying. Yeah, whatever the case was, the baby wept. And exactly what you said, it says she had compassion in that moment. Well, how did all that happen? Well, the Lord had to do all this. He orchestrated all of this. She knows the edict of her father. She knows that he's a Hebrew, and yet she has compassion on him. And that means she's not going to kill him. And yeah, he's weeping, and right. I don't know any women that would see a crying baby so cute. Maybe, he was a little pudgy, and that's not going to pick him up and try to comfort him. I think that's what we see here. Do you think this was the plan all along? Verse 7, then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. Do you think this was organic, or do you think it was planned? Okay, it was planned in the sense that God planned it. Good. I think it was beyond man. I don't think, we can try to say, well, I think this is probably what the mom did. Placed Miriam there to watch. And then if the princess, comes and finds the baby, then Miriam, make sure you say, the Bible gives no indication about that. What we do is we speculate, and we say, well, this is probably the way it was. And when we speculate like that, what do we remove? The God element. That God orchestrated this whole thing. I really think that here's an innocent child, Miriam, she sees and hears her brother cry, rushes over to see this woman having compassion and saying, "Hey, would you mind if I, to have a Hebrew woman nurse this baby?" Well, that's a great idea. And I think that's just, a natural tendency here of probably what took place. What benefits did the family and Moses receive from this arrangement? Look at verse 9. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. Okay? Benefits.
Paid for taking care of her own child.
Okay, paid for taking care of their own child. More importantly, exactly what Barry said. Teaching him God's ways. Now, we think of nursing as in, I'm going to nurse the child until they're like 1, maybe 18 months, and then, that's it. Most likely, they would nurse this child till they're 3, 4 years old. And it would give them plenty of time, ample time. And we even see that. It's indicated in the text that Moses knew he was a Hebrew. Because he saw one of his, and I think it's no accident that he saw one of his Hebrew brothers, essentially, being beaten, and he looked around, and he went, and he killed that Egyptian. Well, I believe that he had a relationship with his family, his Hebrew family. He was taught in that time that he was at home the ways of God, and they stuck with him all along. And so you have that. So the benefits, I think, you have the benefits of they received a wage, but secondly, the benefit of raising their own child and seeing him benefit from the teachings of God's way. Yeah, good. Protection and permission, right? He's permitted to live because the princesses said that, take care of him. So there's the natural protection and the permission. Good. Yeah, great. Good. Yeah, so, okay. So we go to the judge. Okay, we're going to move on, verse 10, as we move through. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him out of the water. It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. Now, how many years do you think have passed here? Yeah, 40 years. 40 years have passed. Okay, so just in a few words, it says, it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. So taking him from a 4-year-old or 5, whatever it was, where he was weaned, to now maybe 35 years later. All right, so it came to pass. Those are the words that describe, and that's kind of what it's like for us when we die, and somebody shows up at our grave marker. They see the day you were born, they see the day you died, and what's your life? It's a little dash in the middle. That's all these days of the struggle that you go through in life. It's all a dash. So I think it's best if we live it for the Lord, and maybe that dash can turn upward and focus on the Lord. But what was Moses' connection to the princess according to verse 10? The child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became, what's the next word? Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, possibly heir to the throne. Okay, there's a legal bond here. We would call it adoption. He's adopted into this home. So what is he going to get from this arrangement? Well, he's going to be educated. We know that he was well educated. What's the benefit of that in the long run? Okay, he's an heir to a degree. I don't know how they would look at, an adopted child versus a biological, but I think there's more to it than that. What? Okay. All right, learning their customs.
He was well educated, so when he went to lead the Israelites out many years later, he was going to have to judge the people, and he would have to know and be smart and intelligent to be able to do all that.
Yeah, he was going to be around people that were making really big decisions. He was going to hear, he was going to see, it was going to be all exemplified before him. He was going to be educated, he was going to learn more than he would have learned if he were a Hebrew, where he probably would have been a shepherd out in the fields, which he eventually did. So the Lord really gave him a well-rounded education, if you will. But the cultural aspect is important. He would know what it's like to be in the court and to stand before Pharaoh, and kind of whereas somebody else might have been, shaking in their boots, would have never wanted to do that. He had grown up in that, and so standing before them, I think it's a big deal. What the Lord did here in orchestrating this event for him to be raised in this way. Do you think that the relationship that Moses had gave him a sense of power, that his relationship to the throne, if you will, gave Moses a sense of power to do what he did in verses 11 and 12. Okay, he was grown, that he went out and unto his brethren in verse 11, looked unto their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting in Hebrew, one of his brethren. It tells us there that he looked out and he saw the way his brethren, his people, were being treated. And then he sees how they're just being mistreated, and he sees one of them being hit. Verse 12. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Okay? So, the question is, do you think that relationship to the throne gave Moses a sense of power to do what he did in verses 11 and 12? What do you think? What do you think were the motivating factors here? Okay, emotion. Seeing his brethren being mistreated, seeing this one. Okay, fair question. He was the, Pharaoh's adopted son, princess's son, grandson. And so why didn't he just say, hey, don't do that? Okay.
I don't think it gave him a sense of power, because he looked both ways, and then he hit him. If he had power, he could have just
Sure, yeah. He looks both ways to make sure nobody's looking before he takes action and does what he does. It's interesting, though, it's almost like he's viewed as a judge in that moment. He's making a judgment, and this is where we have to be careful, because what we want to do is we want to step in and be the judge at certain times. It's a natural tendency where we think we have to be the person that lays down the hammer, and that's not always the case, not always our responsibility, and he kind of took it onto his own. Why do you think Moses had compassion on the Hebrews if he was raised in an Egyptian home as an Egyptian? Why do you think he had compassion? Okay, all about the foundation. Good. Yeah, yes. Okay, possibly. Right? Sure. Needed to be humbled, and God was going to do that. Do you think he ever saw his family after he went to the court? I'm going to say probably, right? I mean, hey, these people, so I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't a relationship there as well. And so there was maybe weekly, play dates, or if nothing else, where they would get together. Apparently, I would guess that the family didn't live that far away from where Pharaoh was, unless, his daughter went a long way to bathe in the water, to go swimming, but not sure. Okay, the criminal. What was the difference between the situation that occurred in verse 11 and the one that occurred in verse 13? When he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? What's the difference here? 2 Hebrews, okay? What else? Okay. Okay, his response was different. So the first day he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And just so you know, this is a Hebrew smiting a Hebrew. The only difference is you remove the Egyptian and you put in the place a Hebrew. Okay, so he had, it says, compassion on the Hebrew before. Now he did have compassion here, but he didn't take it to the next level of murdering. So you see there's a difference here. You can see that his being from the same family is coming out. He's an Israelite, and he's having this kind of compassion. How did Moses' murder get out? Verse 14. And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou didst the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. How did it get out? He looked around, didn't see anybody.
How about the guy that he tried to rescue? He must have been there.
All right, exactly. You might wonder, well, somebody must have been watching. He just didn't see. A little boy on the other side of the fence or something like that. And I think what we do is we forget about the Hebrew that was being beaten. He was there. And I think that's probably how word got out, because these Hebrews hear about it. How do they hear? Well, he goes, and you wouldn't believe it, this Moses guy, an Egyptian, or it looks like an Egyptian, he just killed a guy, and he buried him in the sand to protect me, to save my life. And that word's going to get around pretty fast, especially since he was somewhat of a hero, though not viewed that way by them. Why would Pharaoh seek to have Moses killed in verse 15? Now when Pharaoh heard this, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Okay, why would Pharaoh seek to have Moses killed? Okay. Yeah, yeah. He had to pick sides, and he picked the wrong side in Pharaoh's eyes. So he might say, remember, they're already nervous about or they had been nervous about all these Hebrews. And now you have one from the court, the family court going out. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Maybe there was a sense of, I don't really accept this. This is one of the guys that got away. And because my daughter had compassion on him, she was weak and soft and didn't follow through with orders, and I gave in. So maybe this is his opportunity to end it. Good question. Fair, we don't know, right? Was it the same Pharaoh? Or was this her brother instead? Right. So in those times, they probably lived to be about 100. So it just depends. If she was 20 and dad was 40, the Pharaoh, and it's another 40 years, could have been an old man. Yes. We don't know. Good question, though. I think for obvious reasons, you can't let somebody murder somebody else and get away with it. Otherwise, you look weak. And so he would really look weak if he didn't do something about it, somebody from his own home. So I think this was easier for him because he's an adopted son, a grandson, if you will. Correct, absolutely. And I think it shows here, too, that what God has planted in man is, right versus wrong. He has given us a conscience. And so maybe he had a conscience in this moment, but he didn't about killing people, babies, which is strange. All right, the foreigner. Okay, so we get to the foreigner now. How did the Lord use Moses' time in Midian? Okay, verse 15, verse 16. He sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. That's nice. And then came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. And the shepherds came and drove them away, which is terrible if you think about it. They filled the troughs, which are probably just sitting around the well, where people would just come and fill them up, and then they let their animals drink from them. So the ladies do all the work. These guys come, they scare their animals away, and they get to benefit from what these ladies did. But Moses stood up and he may eat bread. In other words, this is a unicorn. This guy is awesome. And you let him go? You should have invited him home. You're not going to find a guy like this just anywhere. And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter, and she bare him a son, called his name Gershom. For he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. In other words, Gershom means foreigner. Okay, so we only have a few minutes. So let's look at this. How did the Lord use Moses' time in Midian? What was this time? Okay, good. Gave him a family. How else did the Lord use it? Okay, taught him how to lead sheep. He was going to learn how to lead a nation because they're very similar. And I think you were saying the same thing, Brother Hauser. All right, yeah, you see this, all these things coming about. Moses gained favor with his father-in-law, and how did he feel when he heard about Moses' rescue of his daughters? Well, like I would, if somebody rescued my daughter, I would say, well, bring him in so I can meet him and reward him for what he has done. Was it okay for Moses to marry a woman who was not from the tribes of Israel? In other words, who were the Midianites? Is this a trick question? Let's check your Hebrew history. Okay. And who was his wife? Do you remember? Yes. Keturah. So, yes, the Midianites were descendants. They were there as well. So, yes, it was okay for him to marry this woman. desperate for deliverance. How does the response to hardship of the Israelites in verse 23 relate to Isaiah 66:2 and 57:15? Now, I've preached those for a few Sundays already this year. Okay, how does God want his people to come before him? Okay, in humility.
With a contrite heart, and they were groaning, they were desperate.
That's right. They were desperate for help, right? So it says that here at the end. It came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. So I think this is where that king died. So I think it was probably the same one. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. In other words, they were miserable, and so they called out to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them, is the idea there. He knew them. It was like he remembered them. He respected them. He was aware of their need. So verses 24 and 25 tell us something about God. He remembered his covenant, and number two, that these people were desperate. And I would ask you this question as we close, because we're out of time. How does that, and this is just for you, how does that, the way they responded in these verses, relate to you and your relationship with the Lord? I shared on Sunday and I just finished the book about this woman, and I was reading about how she and her husband were being hunted. Her father wanted her dead, and they had put up signs all over the city, train station and everything, in case anybody saw her, that they would capture her and kill her. And in this book, I read about her praying and crying out to God, and how God would orchestrate her protection and the deliverance of her family. And it's fascinating to see how the Lord did that for a person who was desperate. And then she eventually became a refugee in America. It was God's plan. They went through the whole process with the United Nations and became refugees somewhere in the southern United States. And her comment about the U.S. was this: I don't understand how people who are free don't go worship the Lord whenever they can. She said, because where I lived, people hungered and desired to be with other believers whenever they could. And she knew and knows, because she's still alive, what it's like to be desperate and to cry out to God and for God to answer her. And what I'm afraid of is that we don't, because we are so blessed. We can travel quickly, we can choose whether we go to church or not, and we can skip it. I'm not feeling exactly great tonight. And she was just talking about how long they just wanted to be together. They would, the pastor, before he married them, checked the window 3 times to make sure nobody had followed them for this small little wedding, because he could die by performing this wedding, because she was a Muslim who had come to Christ. And we just don't see it and get it. And boy, it was very helpful for me. And so I asked the question: how does that relate to you in your relationship with the Lord? What's your walk with Him? Do you come before Him like they do? That's when the Lord hears us, when we're like that. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for our time in the Word tonight. A great passage. It's about a deliverer, and what we see about this deliverer is he had flaws. He was a murderer. He was a felon. He himself deserved out. And I look at my own self. Do I cry out like they do? Do I long for you like they longed for you? For those are the people that you hear. Lord, I want to be heard by you. So may I come before you fearing you, knowing you are my God and you are at work. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, if you won't be staying with us for the business meeting, you can be dismissed. Otherwise, we're going to get started in 3 minutes, because we'll try to move as quickly as we can. Do we have paperwork? Can you find out, dear?